Welcome to Put Simply, the podcast that puts what's happening around the world simply without compromising on the details. Erdem Koch is my name, and I'm joined by my co-hosts this week again, Ozan Ibrisim and Rodney McCune. Gents, wonderful to see you both.
Good to be with you.
Now, as citizens of Commonwealth countries ourselves, it feels highly relevant to start this week's discussion with what is happening in the Commonwealth. And well, a few things. The CHOGM meeting will be taking place in Samoa, the Commonwealth Heads of Governments meetings. King Charles and Queen Camilla are in Australia for the first time in 60 years, touring the country, and they've been met with some rather controversial scenes from a senator, no doubt, along with other protesters. But let's start with CHOGM and start with you, Rodney. Explain to us, put simply for us, what is CHOGM?
Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and this edition or iteration of it is being held in Samoa. So it's the first time it's been hosted by a Pacific island. It brings together the leadership across the Commonwealth, and they will discuss various themes and so on. For this particular conference, it's a resilient common future, and it's about democracy, strong institutions that support democracy, and climate change, in particular, with so many Commonwealth member states being island states. So the democracy part is an interesting counterbalance to what's going on globally, where you have a clash between authoritarianism and democracy, across, whether it be what's going on in Ukraine with Russia, some of the challenges in the Middle East, and other regions where there are flashpoints, or the West and China, or the West vis-a-vis Russia, or even to an extent, although they're both in the Commonwealth, Canada and India in recent weeks. But there's this rub between authoritarianism and democracy, and maybe the value of the next phase of the Commonwealth and the heads of government grouping is to cut across, the global South, connected to the traditional West, or at least some of the Five Eyes through Canada, Australia, and the UK, and so on, in a way that many traditional institutions, whether it be the G7 or G8 or the 20 or whatever, where there's an economic disconnect, and you can see the BRICS is sort of bringing those countries together. This is a different forum. It's a forum that might be useful to push and maintain democracy, it being one of the themes. But then there's also other issues which will no doubt be elevated by the next Secretary General, Baroness Scotland, who's a member of the House of Lords in the UK. Distinguished lawyer, is standing down, and there's going to be an election for the next Secretary General. The candidate countries are the Gambian Foreign Minister, Ghanaian Foreign Minister, and I think a senator from Lesotho. But in any event, neither of those three countries have held the Secretary Generalship at any level. So there's going to be change after this particular meeting, and I think all three of them had previously pushed the idea of reparations on slavery and colonialism. So that's an interesting dynamic as well.
Well, you've done a good job, Rodney, of trying to make it sound interesting. But I mean, Ozan, is it? And is it relevant?
Very good questions. I mean, if you go on their website and you look at what they're trying to achieve, it's certainly on paper very interesting and could be very relevant. But I think in reality, one has to ask the question, what does Nigeria have in common with Malta? What does Brunei have anything to do with Canada? This is an organization that claims to represent 2.7 billion citizens across the world, across 56 countries, who are about as unrelated to each other as you can get. Now, saying that, obviously they share a common history, but what was the superpower that was kind of at the heart of that common history is no longer the superpower that it was in Britain. So you really have to ask the question: what can you achieve when you've got such diverse interests. There's talk of kind of common democratic principles and democratic institutions, but when you look at the list of the members there, it really is such a mix of countries that are at different levels of development, different economic development, that is, different levels of political development in terms of their institutions. You've got Australia on one side, and African countries like Lesotho, Gabon, Togo, Sierra Leone on the other, and then you've got Canada, Singapore, just very, very different countries with different interests and different agendas. And I think, look, the climate change agenda that many of the Asia Pacific countries are pushing at this CHOGM, I think is very relevant, obviously, to the rest of the world. But I've just got to ask the question whether this is really a relevant platform to be pushing this, considering that it really does seem to have in my opinion, an outdated mandate. Perhaps the whole point of it is to get a bunch of countries that have very little in common with one another together to address some of these concerns. If there's some good that comes out of that, sure, I think it's commendable. But yeah, I think it's a bit of an outdated institution, if you ask me.
Well, climate change is an interesting one because, I mean, we've got COP29 just around the corner in Baku, Azerbaijan. We obviously had COP28 in Dubai last year, one of the biggest COPs, if not the biggest. And again, of course, resulted in absolutely no agreement to go forward. Obviously, on the climate change front, the world has been big on trying to keep global warming to below 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. We've now surpassed that. 29 years of COPs, of world leaders getting together at various cities around the world, and not a lot beyond sort of the Paris Agreement has really happened in this space, which is obviously frustrating a lot of people. I mean, my question is, what does this gathering of Commonwealth heads of governments achieve, even if climate change is the agenda, or is it just another talk fest? Or Rodney, do you think it actually has achieved things in the past and has the potential to achieve things in the future?
I think it certainly has the potential to achieve things in the future. And actually, COP's a good example. There's an opportunity through this heads of government summit to align in advance of COP. So many of the member states of the Commonwealth are island nations. So often these small island nations attend something like COP and find their voices drowned out, or the communiques being diluted and negotiated again and again by the petrochemical states who want to slow down restrictions for their own economic reasons. So I think what we have with this type of meeting is an opportunity for the countries across the Commonwealth who aren't the big oil producers of the world to get an alignment, get an agreed position, and potentially go to things like COP on the same page. And certainly, if I was one of the smaller Commonwealth nations, I would be looking to increase my leverage by working with other member states through this particular forum. Again, Samoa, it's not insignificant that it's being held there, and get that level of cooperation to give my voice more impact at something like COP, which of course is only a short time away. And the Commonwealth is unique because it does cut across regions, races, religions in a way that many supranational organizations simply don't, bar the UN or whatever. But regional organizations like ASEAN, like the European Union, all have this commonality in terms of potentially where they're at economically, but certainly sometimes social outlook and other things. They don't have these type of organizations and groupings of countries which cut across the globe in such number, covering so many of the world's citizens in such a way. And if they can start to get agreed positions on things in advance of big international events, they could have real impact.
But is the summit going to be, or the meeting going to be, about climate change? I mean, that's you mentioned the reparations and the call for this to be on the agenda. Like, is this going to kind of drown out any discussions around the climate change issue? I wonder. I mean, that's something I think we need to kind of look out for, because at the end of the day, there's a number of agendas being put forward here, and the media's, let's face it, going to be much less interested in covering climate change and amplifying any positive discussions that might come out of that. Armor in a corner on topics like reparations, and we saw, as Adam mentioned at the start, a senator in Australia bringing up other issues around reconciliation with the local Indigenous community in Australia, in a very animated way. These are, to me, I think I agree with you. I think the potential's there, and on paper, this organisation could achieve a lot. But I think the politics of, we live in a world where there is a massive, from both sides, but predominantly from the right, a massive kind of backlash towards anything that's kind of looking to be a globalist type of approach. And then, of course, on the left side, you have many of these issues coming up around Indigenous rights and reconciliation, etc. I think these are going to be at the forefront of something like this. And the broader question is, if you ask me, it's unfortunate that Starmer has to deal with this in his first few months in office because it takes away from his local agenda, and he's having to have conversations about stuff that really many people in the UK, I don't think, care about. I think it's the politics of this is very complicated, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. And look, Lamy, the Foreign Secretary, and the new Labour administration's already made comments about reparations and so on in advance of assuming office. But there's a big difference, as they found out from the problems that they had with P&O ferries when they criticised them and their staff in advance of the investment summit, that when you're in government, you have to take a different course sometimes, because obviously they wanted the investment from DP World, I think, is the company that owned P&O ferries anyway. So they're already finding those things pretty early on, and they'll have to navigate this one with Lamy's previous comments as well, which will make news. But sitting underneath whatever discussion, and it may be that people are coming to the summit to reference slavery to satisfy a domestic audience in those countries, but it might be they also get on with the business of something more substantial in terms of what can actually be converted into a positive outcome. And so I don't diminish slavery as being insubstantial, but something that can be substantially achieved at the conference is there's opportunity around that, and it's going to be climate change on this occasion.
I think there's a broader question here around the role of the Commonwealth, and in particular, obviously the UK under King Charles in particular. And we're seeing this play out in Australia. We've already mentioned a couple of times. But, when Queen Elizabeth II died, and obviously the monarchy was passed over to King Charles by virtue of descent, I think myself and many people around the world probably thought, okay, there's an opportunity here to, I guess, for the relevance of the royal family in the UK and around the world from a Commonwealth perspective to really start to be questioned. Obviously, Queen Elizabeth was in many ways the mother and grandmother of the UK and the broader Commonwealth, but Charles has a complicated history, and obviously his relationship with the late Princess Diana is one that has caused a lot of question marks around him, both from a personal perspective and a professional perspective in his capacity as the monarch now. But that, to me, has been turned around by the sheer euphoria that we've seen in a country like Australia, which has long debated whether it's time to become a republic. And there were always questions around, well, this would never happen under Queen Elizabeth II, but if it gets passed on to Charles, and there was talks at one point whether he would sort of just pass it straight on to William to sort of save the royal family, if you will. But when you think about the country that you and I both grew up in, Ozan, in Australia, like, people are coming out in thousands of, there's people getting really excited about seeing King Charles, and to me it's a little bit surprising. Like, I did not think we would we being Australians, react the way that we have reacted in such a positive manner. Have I read the room wrong, or is something else at play here?
The best thing that could have happened to the royal family was, shows like The Crown and other shows where if you ask me, they were able to inject themselves positively into the kind of popular culture. And and as much as I'm not a huge monarchist, I love that show. I'm fascinated by the whole royal family and their role in history and what have you. And I think that there is, you know, there is an appreciation of the royal family amongst um, the globe, I think, around, their kind of role in how history has evolved. And, obviously there's a lot of kind of rumor and gossip, etc., that kind of comes into it as well. But, if you ask me personally, I think the best thing that the Commonwealth can be is as Rodney said, a political force, rather than what obviously it was when Queen Elizabeth went out and visited all, early on. I think it was the first year in her reign. She went out and tried to kind of position the Commonwealth as something of, you know, more kind of a preservation of the empire. But I think the best thing that the royal family can do is allow Commonwealth to become more of a political, potentially an economic force, and having them kind of having some of those important issues being pushed through this platform, rather than getting into some of those issues around the past, reparations and all of this sort of stuff. You're not going to be able, you're not going to be able to get away with from that. But maybe the less that the royal family is the face of CHOGM, the better.
No, look, it's an odd one. People who would position themselves politically left would tend to be the strongest anti-monarchists, right? I think we'd probably agree that's true, and certainly in our countries, and probably many more. But I do wonder, given that it's the left that feels most burdened by populism, whether that's just an unattractive proposition in the current time as well. Given the type of characters which tend to be elected in these one-off votes, that maybe it's better to have a little bit of stability, one less elected position, especially if it's a symbolic head of state and so on, and one less big voice from the right or from the populist, with a populist agenda leading or speaking on behalf of another country.
Speaking of thinking about things differently, let's turn to the Asia Pacific now and to Indonesia, a country that has just sworn in its 8th president, someone who comes with, well, I guess quite a bit of controversy, having been dogged by allegations of human rights abuse for decades and already failed twice to become president. He now takes the helm, and we introduce a fourth voice to our podcast, someone who's not a stranger to, put simply, it's Abdul Malik Anwar Deen, the managing director of Crosby Textor, based in Singapore. Malik has spent a lot of his career focused heavily on Indonesia and is the perfect person to have on this episode to talk simply about what is happening in Indonesia. Malik, welcome back to the podcast. Great to see you again.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be back.
Talk us through what is happening in Indonesia. The country's largest cabinet is now being sworn in, or has been announced, the largest cabinet since the 60s, that is. We have a new president. Explain to us, put simply to us, please, and to our listeners, who is the new president, what is his mandate, and what are we likely to see in the coming days and months ahead?
Not a problem at all. I think you hit a big point. This is probably the largest, it is the largest government in Indonesia since the 1956 election. 112 ministers and deputy ministers were sworn in. If you put this into comparison to the Jokowi government, there were 64 ministers and deputy ministers sworn in. Just a little bit of background, this is the 5th presidential election in Indonesian history. It is also the world's largest single-day election. About 204 million people, or about 75% of Indonesia's population, voted. And the results were surprising to a lot of analysts that it did not go into runoff, because Prabowo and Gibran being Jokowi's son, took about 58.58% of the votes, which means they won the elections in a one-off instead of having to go to a runoff elections, beating Anis and Muhaimin Iskandar, who got 24.95% of the vote. And I suppose the real shock, the PDIP candidates, Megawati's candidate, Ganjar Pranowo and Mahfud, only walked away with 16.47% of the vote. What do I think we will see different from this administration from Jokowi's? I think there'll be a big shift from infrastructure to human capital. And I think that's reflective in the numbers. Prabowo has only allocated about 965 million US dollars to infrastructure type projects in the 2025 budget. And I think this is a sharp decrease from 2.84. Jokowi, of course, developed almost 500 over infrastructure projects over the last 10 years. And that included things like 27 new airports. And he has built more roads than every president in Indonesia's history put together. So, I think there'll be a focus on the focus on infrastructure would not be as strong as Jokowi, and I think there will be a lot more focus on building human capacity instead. So I think there will be a lot of effort to develop human capital in Indonesia, and I think that we'll see a lot of the money going to that.
One of the things that he vowed to do in his inauguration speech over the weekend was to eradicate corruption as well. Malik, you've watched Indonesia for a big part of your career. Is this something that is
more social capital management projects than infrastructure projects?
Yeah. What about on that sort of corruption front? Is this something that's realistically achieved, do you think?
I think all candidates in their election manifestos talked about dealing with corruption and dealing with cleaning up corruption. I suppose what is not very clear is how they're going to do this and by when. I think having a larger government, with a large number of ministers, will probably mean that it will be a government that's a little bit more heavy in terms of rules and regulations and will red tape come out? I think that remains to be seen. How do you deal with the red tape? And usually dealing with the red tape is when corruption also steps in. So there's still a concern about how do they curb corruption in this new government.
Malik, where do you think the foreign affairs policy for Indonesia is heading with the new president? I mean, do you think we're likely to see a different stance on some of the regional tensions, but also some of the the global tensions that we have? Do you think we're going to see a more active Indonesia at the ASEAN level, for example?
What we can see, firstly, from his hire of a foreign minister is someone who is very much someone in his books, a former member of the Army Special Forces, Sugiono, who's 45 years old, joined Prabowo's party as deputy chairperson very early on. He has earned the nickname of being Prabowo's ideological child. So I think what you can decipher from this is that foreign policy would be very much designed according to how Prabowo would want it. And I think Prabowo will be a lot more outward-looking in terms of economic cooperation compared to Jokowi, who was a little bit more inward-looking with a focus of growing Indonesia's economy through internal growth and putting country above self. But I think Prabowo, in contrast, would be more open to collaboration with different countries in order to benefit Indonesia's economy. His first trip after winning the elections was to China, which is, likely to continue to be Indonesia's leading economic partner. He is also been seen to be more willing to attend international forums, and I suspect he will play a more active role in ASEAN in comparison to the Jokowi government. he knows most of the leadership or the past leadership in the ASEAN space as well. And I suspect he will continue to want to play the role as ASEAN's de facto leader and initiate deeper engagement as a leading economy, a leading voice in ASEAN.
Indonesia's had quite a long-standing policy of non-alignment. The country often doesn't ally itself with sort of major power blocks. Is this something that Prabowo will continue, do you think, given the fragmentation that we're seeing around the world, everything that's happening in the Middle East, the ongoing war in Russia and Ukraine, a potential new Trump presidency over in the US? Is this stance likely to be continued under this president?
I think if you looked at his statements just after the swearing in, he was very clear in his speech that Indonesia chooses a free and active path, not aligned. That was quote unquote. Once you translate his speech, that was what he said. I think that is going to be one of the difficulties, and it is a difficulty that's not only shared by Indonesia, but many of the ASEAN countries as well. I think one of the challenges would be balancing the US and China policy and then trying to be independent and pursuing national interests without having to choose sides. It would be a tricky assignment, but given Indonesia's importance as a global economy, I mean, they are on track to become the fifth largest economy in the world. And also the opportunities in terms of energy resources and the role it plays as a gateway to a large ASEAN economy. I think they will play that game a lot better than some of the smaller states in ASEAN who may be beholden or be in a position to choose between the US or China. But I think Prabowo will continue in that stance where he will attempt to play off his relationship with the US and China as well, and making sure that that Indonesia maintains its position as the leader of ASEAN. But I think he was very clear in his speech that Indonesia chooses a free and active path that is not aligned, and I think that will continue for the next 4 to 5 years.
Can I just ask about the size of government? And I mean, we're not talking about just big government on an Indonesian experience. It's big government on a pretty much a global scale, given the number of ministries. And I absolutely take your point that it presents as a challenge for corruption, tackling corruption and so on with such a larger government. But what about on things like policy, alignment, unified communications? I mean, it's going to really have a challenge of setting clarity of direction as a government. Is there going to be some sort of beefed up centre of government operation to counterweight all these ministries and try and exercise a level of control? Or is that something we're going to see further down the line out of necessity, do you think?
I think it will be a struggle for a country with so many islands and of its size to provide more clarity with a larger government in place. I think you will see probably more decentralized power. And if you look at some of the hires into the defense ministry, the finance minister and the finance ministries, the foreign affairs, loyalists have been hired. People who I would say are cut from the same cloth as Prabowo or ideological children of Prabowo. And I think that is one way the president will maintain control on defense and foreign affairs. In terms of the economic front, it's quite interesting because most of the economic related ministers remains the same as Jokowi's administration. So you see people like Sri Mulyani, who's a well-respected economist, and earlier in her career served as a managing director of the World Bank. She's kept her position as finance minister when there were a lot of speculation that she will not serve under a Prabowo government. You've got heavyweights like Luhut Panjaitan, chairing the economic policy arm of the government. So there is a good mix of loyalists, but also a good mix of people who have done well for the Jokowi government, especially the economic space, who have been retained. I think with the moving of the capital to Kalimantan as well, some businesses have expressed concern that that would add into a layer of inconvenience of doing business, having to perhaps open another branch in Kalimantan, so that you can get government decisions or permits approved. So there is a concern as well that the new capital city is moving to a different island. But it is definitely a very large group of people who have been appointed ministers and deputy ministers. 112 is the last count that we did. And that would probably mean that, or probably also means that, Prabowo has failed or lost 3 elections before this. And I suppose, after losing 3 elections, you have to reward certain people with certain positions as well. And the large number of people in the ministerial or deputy ministerial positions could possibly reflect the fact that that loyalists needed to be taken care of as well.
Well, Malik, that's one president sworn in, done and dusted. But of course, there's another presidential race that we're going to discuss in detail in a moment. But we cannot let you go without a prediction on the US election. Who will win?
Oof. You made me predict the Indonesian elections. I got away with it. I said 1 round Prabowo, so I'm very proud of myself on that one.
So you should be.
I think at this stage, looking at the numbers and looking at the pathways to the White House and the swing states, I think it would have to be Trump, who has probably an easier route to the White House than Kamala. So that would be my prediction.
Well, let's see. We'll pick you up on that post November 5, my friend Malik. It's always such a pleasure to have you on Put Simply. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Thank you very much. Always happy to be here. Thank you.
Abdul Malik from Crosby Textor in Singapore with his observations on Indonesia. And let's pick up on his final point, whether Trump or Kamala Harris wins. His prediction is Trump. But Rodney, I'm going to start by asking you the biggest, single, most important issue in US politics at the moment. Did Kamala Harris work for McDonald's, yes or no?
I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no, and I'm going to go back and put my evidence lawyer's hat on for this. She's made no effort whatsoever to counter the challenge that she didn't. And as bizarre as the Republican challenge on this is, because it's like arguing over who's better at golf, it has no relevance whatsoever for the election. It's an issue that people are talking about. It's been amplified by or focused on again by Trump going to salt fries in a McDonald's over the weekend, which, by the way, was a great piece of campaigning for him. It was a success, absorbed a lot of news coverage, oxygen, lots of footage of it on social media. That's certainly a win for Trump. Although it was an attempt to troll Harris, yeah, I don't know. I don't care whether she's worked at McDonald's or a lesser well-known burger and fries place, to be honest. It would make no difference to me if I was going to vote for her or not. But it does, if she didn't work there, seem like a very odd thing to say you did do to try and form some sort of weird connection with a voter base.
Well, if she'd worked for Burger King, she would have had my vote automatically. I can tell you that much.
Even though you can't vote. But let's not get into the details, shall we, of how this thing's actually going to work. Ozan, you've worked in politics for a long time. I mean, this is one of those extraordinary moments, isn't it, when, who cares about foreign policy? Who cares about domestic sort of tax regimes? Who cares about, her handout to first home buyers, etc.? These are one of those moments that, and to Rodney's point, Trump then capitalizes on it beautifully by heading over to a McDonald's. It's one of these sticking things that, unfortunately, the layperson tends to talk about, and she could have killed it off a long time ago. And as we know, 48 hours is a long time in politics. She hasn't, which then obviously makes people like us think, well, then she probably didn't. And she perhaps didn't tell the truth around that. It feels like with 2 weeks to go now till the polling day, and obviously early voting has started, it's sort of little issues like these that are going to come along. It doesn't feel like there's anything big coming in the next sort of 2 weeks. And obviously the big push has to be on voter turnout.
Absolutely. They talk in the US election quite a bit about October surprises. I mean, October's nearly over. We haven't had a huge October surprise. I suppose the two hurricanes that hit Florida, southern USA, US coast, I suppose in some sense were surprises and tested the response of President Biden and Vice President Harris, and I think they got through that okay, despite trying to have the Republicans and former President Trump accuse them of all sorts of incompetence in dealing with the aftermath of the hurricanes. I think they got through that okay. But look, I don't think anything's going to happen between now and 2 weeks. I think we're 14 days away from polling day. That's going to substantially change the course of this election. I think at the end of the day, as you said, things like letting an issue about whether you worked at McDonald's or not run for 2 days, I don't think is going to make any difference to the decision for people to vote or not. But what it does do is it steals the oxygen and it prevents her from being able to put an articulate and a strong kind of closing pitch forward, which she needs to do more than Trump. I think Trump's hit his ceiling. I don't think there's much room for Trump to grow. I think the polls have been pretty consistent in terms of his support. His job is to get all of those people out. It's a risky strategy that he's actually put in place, where a lot of those votes that he's relying on are traditionally low propensity voters or people who don't come out and vote very often. But if he can get them out, he's going to hit his ceiling. And then for her, she needs to convince people over the next 2 weeks that it's she's the right choice, and that she's the one that they need to kind of get off the couch for and go out and vote. And at the end of the day, a lot of this is going to come down to the margins, and I think it's really going to come down to how some of the Latino population votes. There's been a lot of talk around particularly black young men in terms of how they're going to vote. Trump's made some serious inroads with that demographic, but again, I was listening to a commentator today, and she's relying, where her strong kind of support is with women in the suburbs, college educated, and she's making significant inroads into the non-college educated women. Whereas Trump's relying on a segment of the population like non-college educated men, white men, but also more and more black men. Traditionally, these, the women, there's more of them, first of all. It's a bigger population and more reliable voting population. So she needs to make sure that they all come out. And then at the end of the day, I think this is a toss-up. There's no kind of clear winner in sight at this point in time. And they need to really get their ground game running as much as they can. They have an advantage on that. I think the Democrats have traditionally always had an advantage on the kind of ground game and getting their vote out. But I think the Trump has never had an issue with getting his core supporters out, but he's got to get some of those people that he's relying to hit 47, 48% across the board.
The other thing, which is the whole Trump's mad, old, unhinged, it's just becoming a bit tired. He called her a shit vice president. He gave a speech in front of kids where he was referring to how impressive Arnold Palmer's club was in the showers with the other players after some round of golf.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't matter what he says anymore, and it doesn't matter how much the mainstream media criticize some of the crazy stuff that he says. It's just making no difference whatsoever. if her final pitch is limited to he's so unsuitable, it's not going to cut enough sway with people to. I mean, short of Dick Cheney and AOC coming out on stage hand in hand, calling for Harris, calling for the great American people to vote for Harris. I'm not sure what they could do to try and suck oxygen from Trump and actually go and present some new phase of what they're trying to do. I mean, her campaign way back from the convention was about turning the page, but she's not told us what's on page 2. And I have no idea what the future under Kamala Harris really looks like. And that's from someone who's trying their best to follow this closely. She is the continuity candidate.
So look, I think we need to put these things into perspective and add some context around it. Like, absolutely, has she struggled to get a proper narrative out there about what she would do under Kamala Harris's administration that would be different from Biden? Yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, and I'm not trying to defend her, but you've got a massive discrepancy between what the economy actually is when you look at the economic data. Now we can argue about the kind of robustness of that data, but that's a different story. And then what people are feeling. And at the end of the day, when most of the polling is saying that people feel that the country, 70% of people on average are saying that the country is going in the wrong direction. I mean, in any other election where Trump was not the candidate, the incumbent should have, I mean, the opposing candidate against Kamala Harris should be up 10 or 15 percentage points. So the fact that, we're in this scenario where it's so tight is, it says a lot about how bad of a candidate Trump actually is. Whether he wins or not is, again, a different story. But, and at the end of the day, I think it's a missed opportunity on her part to try and capitalize on that. And I don't think, you don't have to look very far then having, Trump in a town hall and suddenly putting on his favorite playlist of songs and swaying around for 39 minutes to kind of see that there's something wrong there, and he's clearly not all there. And with all of the other things that have happened in the last 4 or 5 years. But to your point, Rodney, it makes no difference. He's hit his ceiling. This is what Trump's going to get in terms of votes. But the opportunity still is there for Kamala Harris in the next 2 weeks to win that 1%, 2%. That might be the difference between getting the 270 electoral college votes that's required to win the presidency. And I think she can still do that. Although as every day goes past, I am questioning whether that's actually going to happen.
Well, all will be revealed, no doubt, when Americans go to the polls, many of which have, of course, already voted. Early voting is a big thing in the US this year. But, the remainder of the voters will head out in 2 weeks' time. And maybe one thing that may very well persuade them is some money from Mr. Elon Musk. Rodney, what is happening there? Explain it to us.
It's quite an interesting device, potentially, to navigate electoral law, where he's offering a prize if you sign a petition, and then the data that you need to supply to confirm that you've supported the petition allows you to be micro-targeted on Get the Vote Out and for other type of ads. And there's been some interesting stuff around that in the past week. I think it was NBC did a piece where they were able to show micro-targeting ads where to a Muslim audience, Harris was being dressed up as the most pro-Israel candidate ever, with the first potential first male lady, first husband, first whatever, who is Jewish and so on. And then there was a separate ad going out to a Jewish audience, which was accusing Harris of being pro Palestine and soft on Hamas and this sort of thing. And these were going out at the same time to different audiences saying exactly the opposite, but whatever satisfied that audience in terms of what Trump would like the outcome to be, or the Republicans would. And it was produced by one of these PACs that Musk was putting money into. And I suspect that this harvesting of data, it will be used in the last 2 weeks of the campaign to get the vote out. This is an attempt to get those non-voters who are likely to vote Trump, as Ozan said earlier, to get off the couch and go out and vote. And that's often a great challenge, to get the non-voter to go out and vote. But this is one of the devices that they're clearly using to try and do that, as well as potentially for micro-targeting with bespoke ads.
I'm also a little bit confused about that whole, the term "get off the couch and vote." It's a Tuesday, and I'm not sure, but is it a public holiday in the US to vote? It assumes that everyone's just sitting on the couch on Tuesdays, when we know that that's not the case, because most people have about 3 jobs. So
I think it's come from the whole JD Vance thing and couches, that the Democrats started to say, get off the couch.
Yeah.
And I think it's stuck. And I think that's a very fair point, Ozan, that many of the target voters that they're trying to get the vote out with and energize and excite might not be on their couch in the first place. They might be at McDonald's with fries, salted fries. Or whatever.
They might be working one of the 3 jobs they have. Yeah. Anyway, just being cheeky.
Cheeky indeed. And somewhere else it's cheeky that's caught your attention, Rodney, over the last week is a certain Eastern European country, mostly famous for its wine, but there's another claim to fame now.
Yeah, so I've never had the privilege of sampling Moldovan wine, but they're in a similar phase of election interference. They're like Georgia, like Ukraine. They're on the edges of Russian influence, and they're taking the view that they might want to point west. They had a presidential election 2 days ago, and at the same time had a referendum on enshrining in the constitution a direction of travel, which would be ultimately to join the European Union. In the run-up to the referendum, it was 60% in favour, and they just squeaked by on Sunday with 50.5%. The sitting president Maya Sandu, who is pro-Europe, the Moldovan Zelensky, which I'm sure is not something she probably wants to be called, but from our perspective, the Moldovan Zelensky has got 42%. She's now going to go into a runoff against a pro-Russia bloc potentially, with a lead candidate who is a former, I think, Attorney General or Prosecutor General, who she sacked a few years before, but is very pro-Russian. And then they're being the opposition's being bankrolled by a Moldovan in exile in Russia, who's an oligarch or a billionaire or whatever, who's just funneling money into the country to buy literally to buy votes. There was a plane stopped a couple of months back of Russian nationals flying via, I think, Azerbaijan to Moldova, and each one of 100 who were stopped on that flight had a few euros short of the 10,000 minimum maximum before you had to declare, and they were able to see something like 990,000 euros from that flight. The sitting president, Maya Sandu, has already said that there's been about 100 million euros spent by external organized crime and external forces, by which she means Russia, but doesn't want to name them, during the course of this election. There are Russian-speaking areas of Moldova. They've obviously been targeted, but we're looking at misinformation, so lots of social media stuff like America, where it's okay to lie. There's threats that if they join the EU, they'll be forced to introduce same-sex marriage. It's this type of social media type advertising. There's also been orchestration of civil unrest, which has been again placed responsibility for that on Russia or external influence. And then there's just been straight vote buying, where some 130,000 voters in a very small country, so a significant part of the electorate, have been approached or offered money simply to vote against the president or against the EU referendum. They've been paid to post hostile to the president and to the European Union on the referendum content on social media and so on. And of course, Russia says nothing to do with us. And I think as the results come in, the Kremlin has already said that they thought there's been some electoral irregularities with the process, which is slightly mischievous given the significant potential electoral influence that they've sought to exert. And, you know, if we look at where the polls are at against the reality, you're talking about being able to, with money and negative misinformation and campaignings and so on, being able to move the dial by something like 10%. The other thing which is significant is some Moldovans who are pro-European Union and are pro the president are so fearful of what Russia might do as a consequence of any decision to move towards the European Union, Ukraine being the very obvious example, have voted against it. And some of those people have been interviewed by British journalists and British media who've been covering the election, where they've said simply that my outlook's A, but I'm voting, or I voted, or I'm going to vote B in the runoff or whatever, because I fear if we vote or are seen to vote against Russian influence, that we may end up on the wrong side of future military action, which is dreadful. And of course, you know, when we look at what's happened in Ukraine, what's happening in Moldova, the runoff is, I think, in 2 weeks. And then we move to Georgia as well, where the same patterns happening. There's an election. There's a clear agenda that Russia wants to pursue, and it's going to play out in Georgia after Moldova. Quite scary.
Well, 2024 is the year that just keeps on giving, even in this late stage, and no doubt still a few gifts and a few surprises to go as we see out the rest of the year, particularly in the US. Gents, next week we will talk about US politics for the last time before the polls are then held. And, well, let's see, hopefully we will know the result on election night. It's been wonderful chatting to you both this week. See you next.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
And that's been this week's episode of Put Simply. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn at Oroku Group to stay up to date with all the latest episodes and news. Feel free to leave a comment and suggestions on what you'd like to see featured on the podcast as well. Until next time, I'm Erdem Koch.
And I'm Ozan Ibrisim.
Thanks for listening.